We continue our conversation here at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. This is History as It Happens on location at the former plantation of one of the most important figures in American history. Hello once more to Monticello's Brandon Dillard.
Hey, Martin.
It's good to have you back, although we haven't really gone anywhere. And to Alan Taylor, who made his way up the mountain from his classroom at Jefferson's old university. How are you, Alan?
I'm very good because I didn't have to walk up.
That's right. Well, yes, you have a modern...
I have a nice road up here.
Yes, modern conveyance, an automobile. And in part one, just to remind our listeners, part one of this series, we talked about what Jefferson wanted his vision for the country in the areas of democracy, partisanship, slavery, race relations, human progress. Today, or in this episode, we're going to talk about the history wars. So, Brandon, last year I had the president of the Heritage Foundation in my studio to talk to him about a number of things, including a report that his organization put out called A Tale of Three Presidential Houses, with the rather unoriginal subtitle of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And in it, he says about Monticello and Montpelier, and I'd like for you to respond to this. The tour scripts and exhibit text at Monticello and Montpelier relegate the achievements of their owners to the background, at best an indefensible oddity, considering the contributions of Jefferson and Madison. Unfortunately for visitors to these two homes, historical interpretation has descended into a contorted narrative poisoned by the inanity of modern political correctness. The fact that these distorted views are funded by so many radically left-wing foundations and activists at least proves the point. History matters. That is the Heritage Foundation.
I'd say that I agree on the point that history matters. And I think that, there's a lot to unpack there. And when you and I talked about this before the podcast, we talked about this report, which I did read. And I mentioned that I read anything that gets written about Monticello because I take any criticism about our work very seriously. And I want to read what people have to say about it. And I want to think about that and process that. And if necessary, incorporate it into our work. And I think that what we can say about the work that has been ongoing at Montpelier, at Monticello, at Highland, at Mount Vernon, these presidential sites that are also sites of enslavement, is that for decades now, the people who work here have been making sure that the stories that are told are histories that include all of the people who lived at these sites. And that doesn't mean that we don't talk about the presidents who lived at these historic sites, but it does mean that in addition to talking about the presidents and their accomplishments, it means that we're also going to talk about the people who they held in bondage. And when you talk about people who are held in bondage, you have to confront the paradox of people who dedicated their lives to a fight for freedom while enslaving others.
Well, it would be most of the people who lived here were enslaved, and they built the place. They did the cooking, the cleaning, the cultivating. I told Kevin Roberts, who's the Heritage Foundation head, I told him that I disagreed strongly with this interpretation, to borrow their term, of what's happening here at Monticello. I have never come away from many visits, I come here every year, at Monticello thinking that Jefferson is somehow in the background or that the views are distorted. When you hear that about modern political correctness, Alan Taylor, do you read between the lines there? What are they trying to say?
I think he would have been much happier with interpretation here 40 years ago when there would be virtually no reference to slavery, or would just refer to the servants. There are people who are uncomfortable with any change in historical interpretation and will want to denigrate that as political correctness. I've been coming here for many years, and I pay very close attention to the films, the exhibits here, the signage, to what interpreters say. And I am very impressed by the respect with which Jefferson is treated here, but also the respect, as Brandon says, for all of the people who lived here. And it's a very tough thing to do, to be able to convey at the same time your respect for the accomplishments and the abilities of Thomas Jefferson, and to put him in the context of this very complex and, frankly, troubled community that he lived in at the same time. And I am very impressed with how Montpelier's done it, how Monticello's done it, how Ashland Highland's done it, and Mount Vernon. And I think that any open-minded person that comes here and thoroughly listens and looks at things would come away with the same conclusion.
So in the report, some of the examples they cite, to boil it down, is that too much talk of slavery. I mean, they mention how the slavery tour is even longer than the house tour, one example they gave. It's not possible to talk too much about slavery at what was a plantation. I mean, am I crazy for saying that?
I don't think so. I think that it's necessary to talk about slavery and enslaved people at a plantation to understand what it was. I think that many visitors are surprised to learn that even Jefferson wrote about slavery as much as any other subject throughout the course of his long life. And I think that it surprises many people to know that we don't actually have a scripted tour. That's not how it works here at Monticello. Our interpreters are very well trained. They're highly skilled professionals. And often what happens on the tours is that they're responding to the interest and the questions of the group. So what might actually be happening is that people on the tours are asking questions about slavery because they are either just fascinated by the subject or, as is often the case, confused by that very paradox that we've been discussing.
One more issue about the Heritage Report, and then we'll move on to other things as it pertains to the history wars. Sally Hemings, the report says, Monticello misleads its visitors by not telling them clearly enough that there's another side to this story, and that the scholarship that says or denies a relationship between Jefferson and Hemings is just as compelling as the scholarship, or maybe it's just as compelling as the scholarship on the other side that says there was a relationship. I don't think there's a controversy here. I think the scholarship is pretty convincing on the side of a relationship, Alan.
Well, I would say there is a controversy, but the evidence, if we're actually going to follow the evidence, suggests that people who are trying to craft an alternative to Jefferson being the father of Sally Hemings' children, they just don't have any evidence. It's really a very one-sided conversation if we are following actual evidence.
What was the impetus for building an exhibit for Sally Hemings and her experience in the main house here at Monticello?
Well, I think it's the same as when you're having a conversation about Jefferson. And, we got into this in our last podcast, which is that looking at Jefferson is fascinating in its own right, but it is important because it is a way for us to understand the times in which he lived. Like Jefferson is a brilliant lens for us to understand the founding generation. We can look through his life, his controversies, his writings, and have a better understanding of that time. That is just as true for the life of Sally Hemings, who, as an enslaved woman, we don't know as much detail about her life, but we know a lot more details about her life than we do the vast majority of women who were held in slavery.
And we don't know what she looked like, and the exhibit does a wonderful job of portraying the family with silhouettes. And why don't you talk a little bit about what that exhibit does, because I think it's the most moving exhibit you have here.
More work went into that exhibit than I think in anything I've personally worked on in my life. And I think that it was very important for us to make sure that, to use Alan's word earlier, that we treated this story as respectfully as it deserved. And because there are no images of Sally Hemings, we had a lot of conversations about how do we represent her as a human being, as a person, to make sure that our visitors have a human connection. And so that resulted in having a figure of a woman whose face is not part of the figure because we couldn't say what she looked like, but to still demonstrate that this is a human. And we used entirely selections from the words of her son, Madison Hemings, when he talked about his mother and his father, Thomas Jefferson. And we used audio-video short film that shows silhouettes of some of the children and uses primary source documents to talk about their life. And it's brief, but we wanted to make sure that the emotional impact was the point.
Long after Jefferson's death, his son, Madison Hemings, told a newspaper reporter that my father was Thomas Jefferson. So it's not like this evidence is new. Why has that evidence been, or why was that evidence? Oh, it's still being dismissed to some degree, I suppose. I have Annette Gordon Reed's first book on the subject, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. The reason I'm citing this one is that it was written prior to the DNA testing. And even then, she says, as you did, Alan, the evidence was overwhelmingly circumstantial, yes, but overwhelmingly on the side of there being a relationship. She writes, the defensive posture of old has not gone away. This book is from the late 90s. In fact, that method of response to deny the relationship seems to be resurging as a backlash against multiculturalism and, quote, reinterpretation of history moves across the nation. Well, you might say that's still the case now, wouldn't you?
Well, what I'd want to begin with is, again, Jefferson is not that unusual.
Yes,
There
exactly.
are a lot of masters who have slave mistresses. Jefferson is just the highest profile of them, and he was high profile in his time. And in his time, there were people who would cite Jefferson, either positively or negatively, as an example of a master who had children by a slave mistress. So I think we need to just understand that slavery is a sexual system, among other things, and masters have privileged access. Now, he did have to apparently, and it seems quite clear, negotiate the relationship with Sally Hemings, and she was able to achieve certain things for herself and for her children as a result of this relationship.
While they were in France, Jefferson and Hemings in France, right?
It's our understanding that that's where the conversations were framed and when she entered into this relationship. But it's an ongoing relationship, and it must have been an ongoing negotiation as well.
For those who say, maybe this is people who fall more on the left of the political spectrum today, why are you calling this a relationship? This was exploitative. The power imbalance was obvious. He was the master, she was the slave. How do you approach that issue, Brandon? Because it's touchy. We've talked a little bit about how some folks on the right can be sensitive and touchy on some of these issues, but on the left, it's there just as intensely.
I think you're right. I think it's a touchy conversation. And the word relationship has a lot of contemporary connotation that isn't necessarily implied by its use. So you and I just met, Martin. But
yes.
There's a relationship between us, right? So using it in the broadest sense of understanding that there was some kind of interaction. Annette Gordon-Reed often uses the word liaison.
Yes.
And I found that there's not a word that can actually describe this or what it was. And I think the most important part when we talk about it with visitors is that we try to fully convey the complete power imbalance that must have existed between a 16-year-old girl and a 46-year-old man who enslaved her. So there's a 30-year age difference. There's an entire system of power dynamics by which her every move is legally owned by him. And so consent is not part of the conversation. But the flip side of that, and I think this is important, is that we also don't know how she felt about him. And we don't know what her actions were. And to say with any certainty that we know one way or the other, that denies her the same agency that she was denied by the system of slavery.
Exactly. She had agency. And Annette Gordon-Reed, her telling of it is when they were in France, she was able to negotiate, as Alan said, freedom for her children if she would return to Virginia with Jefferson, because she could have stayed in France as a free person, according to Annette Gordon-Reed. And I take it you agree with that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, it's a very thorough book.
Which is on sale here in the Monticello gift shop. Are Alan Taylor's books on sale in the Monticello?
Yes.
Oh, man, well, I'm never going back in there again. So I think I know what the answer to this question is going to be, Brandon. Have the history wars arrived here at Monticello? Joseph Ellis was on the Mount Vernon version of my podcast last year. He told me that places like this, Colonial Williamsburg, Montpelier, are having trouble with ornery and angry visitors who don't like all this talk of slavery, or on the other side of the political spectrum, think that you're going too easy on Jefferson, 43-year-old man, 16-year-old enslaved girl. What has happened here? Have you had any of these bad experiences?
Yes. And I mean, that kind of thing is part and parcel of being a public history site. It's also not new, but I would say that we're in a particularly increased moment where we're seeing quite a bit of it. Remembering that Monticello is a historic site, which means that it's a tourist site in a lot of ways. You know, people come here, broad swaths of the public come here, and they have all kinds of their own baggage when they come up to this place. What is interesting is when they get really emotional about it, it is a place that inspires lots of different kinds of emotions for lots of different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I never leave here clicking my heels in the air, even though I love it here. I always leave here with a certain melancholy about what was going on here. Do you have any examples? I mean, you mentioned one before we started recording of one of your tour guides, 20-something volunteer tour guide, just trying to do her part, took a tongue lashing from someone?
That story can be told many times over.
Oh, that's too bad.
And it is true that people, they get very heated and they often are quite confrontational with tour guides. And this is something that is being increasingly documented and discussed, field-wide. You see things like people who aggressively assert that what is happening is politically correct, some kind of pandering. But I think it's important to make this note, and this gets back to the conversation about Jefferson's paternity of Hemings' children. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation that owns and operates Monticello doesn't make these decisions on its own, right? We interpret a history based on the advisement of academic scholars, some of whom work here, some of whom are external. And
one who's sitting here with
one is sitting here, right? And we look at what the scholarship says, and that's what we present. And we take that seriously, that we believe that what we are presenting is the most accurate and scholarly representation of the past that we present to the public in a way that is engaging for public audiences.
I see you have security here now. I don't remember that in past years.
They've always been here,
Okay.
but I think that we're currently updating the layout of our visitor center,
Okay.
so it just looks a little different.
I mean, I've just heard anecdotally that I think actually, Alan, I think you told me this when we had lunch last fall, that in some cases people almost come to blows.
Well, I don't know if they come to blows, but I do think, it's not just here, but throughout our country, there's a lot of anger. There are a lot of people who feel that the country is changing in ways that they have no control over, and it makes them very, very angry. And they often invest their vision of what America is or should be with a notion of history. So when they come to a place like here, they come here prepared to be upset. And they hear things like Thomas Jefferson had children by Sally Hemings, and it can set some people off. So, I don't...
Almost as if you told the person himself, hey, you had children with a 16-year-old. I mean, they identify
Well,
at an emotional
identify,
level.
They have a notion of, Jefferson and other founders as being of a superior order of statesmen, and that discussion of slavery at all, and particularly of the sexual dimensions of slavery, it's really upsetting to them. So I feel badly for the poor interpreters who are just trying to do a good job of conveying the evidence as best we understand it. They are not trying to denigrate Jefferson, I guarantee that.
You talk to, as a scholar, you do some informal consulting, right, with the foundation here. You talk to tour guides, give them advice on how to approach these subjects?
On several subjects, I've been invited to come here and give presentations.
Okay.
Yep.
What kind of advice do you give them when it comes to these sensitive things? I mean, my advice would be just tell the truth.
I don't have to give them advice on that.
Okay.
They're very well trained here.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. But what I have found is that if I come in here and I give a presentation which is about Thomas Jefferson and education or Jefferson and slavery, I've done both of those things here. I do find that the interpreters appreciate having someone provide support for them, kind of validation that the things that they've been reading, they're on the right track. I've looked at this stuff and I interpret it in ways very compatible with how they are trying to convey it to an audience.
Who wants to deal with an ignorant bully shouting at you because he thinks you know or she thinks she knows more than you do when you've taken the time to familiarize yourself with the information? And you can tell, Brandon, what a great interviewer I am. I should have asked you that question rather than Alan. But I am curious about this. I asked the folks at Mount Vernon the same question. What do you have to do to become a tour guide here as far as information goes? Obviously, you don't need to have a PhD in history.
You don't need to, but some of our interpreters do.
Oh, wow.
And I think that it's worth noting that the field is changing, and a lot of people who work at historic house museums throughout the country now are doing this as a profession. And I think the pandemic had an impact on this, that prior to the pandemic, a lot of people who did this work, they did it as a sort of like a hobby job in retirement. A lot of people who just wanted to come do this as a part-time job. And we still have a lot of people who do it as a part-time job. But we also have a number of people who have gone to graduate school to learn about public history and to learn about historical interpretation, and who are doing this as a career. All of them, part-time, full-time, whether they do it as their occupation and their career, or whether they do it as something in retirement, or whether they just do it on the side. To underscore what Alan said again, they do it because they love history. Nobody who works at a place like this is getting rich or famous because of this.
And that was not meant as a slight against people who don't have PhDs in history, because I don't either. As a matter of fact, I don't have a PhD in anything. I'm a journalist. That's right down there with attorneys on the popularity scale in the United States. So I guess what the real issue here fundamentally is we're dealing with origin stories. Origin stories matter. The subject is old, but the issue is fresh. And most nations have origin stories. Probably all nations have origin stories. They're a combination of truth and myth. And I think what you're trying to do here is separate those two things, and that's what gets people a little bit on edge. You want to address the importance of origin stories and how they're really not part of the past, Alan. They're part of our present.
Well, they certainly are part of our present, and it will ever be so. You know, the American Revolution is always going to loom very large in American sense of who they are. But Americans don't agree on who we are or what our political institutions should do. I just wish people were a little more comfortable with disagreement in this country and were more comfortable with the need for compromise in order to address the problems we have in this country.
Conversation and debate does not mean having one person speak to you and then you shout at them to prevent them from talking. Mm-hmm. That happens far too often in our nation on college campuses, although I think that problem is probably overstated. I mean, is that an overstated problem?
Well, I would say it's a problem not just on universities. Yeah. I think throughout our culture, there is a tendency not to want to hear what people say that differs from your own perspective.
Right. You can always stay home and not go to the event. I mean, it's hard for me to tell, even though I am in the news business, because I do see these news stories just as you do. If somebody's invited to speak at a college campus, people show up and prevent that person from speaking. I wonder how bad that problem actually is. I mean, I don't really hear it happening where you are.
You know, I think it happens very rarely. You know, I think it's unfortunate when it happens at all. There are people who come in within the intent to be provocative and to attract these episodes. And I think the appropriate response when somebody comes in with that intent is to just ignore them. But that's not what happens.
To what extent is Jefferson's life still shrouded in myth? I always find figures like him hard to approach no matter how much I read about them. There's still an element of mystery there.
Jefferson was pretty mysterious. I mean, he himself was a complicated guy who, you know, his mind worked in a way that is uncommon. And I think we can say that fairly, regardless of how people feel about him today. But, you know, there's a difference between history and memory. And, you know, what we're talking about is people's memory, like public memory, shared memory they bring with them is part of that baggage that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, well, your background's in anthropology, right?
Right. And philosophy. So I really focus on these big abstract questions.
Well, you belong here then.
I love it here. And I love that working here allows me to have all of these broad questions about what these things mean, which goes from the content of Jefferson, who was grappling with some of these same things during his own life, but also today what it means as a historic site 2 centuries after his death. People, they carry this baggage with them, good and bad, of what they think these stories are about. And I think that there is some myth around it. I don't think there's nearly as much myth as there is around George Washington, who is literally seen as this demigod.
Yeah.
But I think that people often have a false impression of who Jefferson was. And when we have conversations about who he was as a person, when we can get through some of that complexity, things like what we talked about on the last episode, his ideas about religion, his ideas about partisan politics, people are surprised by it.
What are some other things people get wrong about him?
Well, some of the basics are pretty common. You know, I mentioned, the thing about people aren't quite sure which founding document he was involved in. And I mean, this is not meant to be insulting to people who don't spend their lives studying history. If you were to ask me something about computer science, it would be very embarrassing what I would say. So
keep away math and science and literature. Like when I watch Jeopardy every single night, I'm pretty good on the history categories. Everything else, forget it. But go ahead.
Yeah, and then that's it, right? It's that different people have different interests, but everyone is broadly interested in this subject enough that when they come here, they want to learn a little bit about it.
How have exhibits changed over the years?
Oh, that's constantly evolving. And that's important, right? And I think this is a key part of this debate right now is that people say things like, well, you know, revisionism is destroying history.
Or you're changing it for political reasons rather than new information.
Right. But if we didn't reinterpret and try and reevaluate and re-understand history with each generation, there would be no need for new historians. And it's important that we have historians for each generation so that we can have a better understanding of the past, not only for what it meant back then, but for what it means today. And so we try to do things like update our interpretation, update our exhibits, not only to keep it fresh for return visitors like yourself, but also to make sure that we are relevant to the contemporary discourse.
Revisionism among professional historians, Alan, is not a bad word.
Well, you are expected as a historian not just to repeat things that have been said in the past. You're expected to more thoroughly seek out new sources of information about the past and then to interpret it in a conversation with the people in your own time. So as I think about it, historians are interpreters between the past and the present. And the present is constantly changing. When I think about how history was presented here 40 or 50 years ago, the assumption was you're presenting it to an entirely white visitorship. And you're telling a story that they would like to hear. I think that Brandon and his colleagues have made a conscientious effort in recent decades to say it is our responsibility to communicate to all Americans what makes Jefferson meaningful and what makes him difficult for us today. That's not an easy thing to do, and I have enormous respect for what they do here.
And I don't like it when people denigrate the work that you're doing. You're professionals, just as I get defensive when people criticize journalists. Well, we're dealing with a deficit of trust. There is a trust deficit in our society today. To the point about professionalism and scholarship guiding your work here, I think it's probably assumed by some folks that the 1619 Project has had an influence on how you're interpreting slavery here. Is that true at all?
In as much as it has had an influence on academic understanding of how we look at the past. I mean, it's certainly something that everybody here is aware of.
Yeah.
We've read it. We've met some of the authors that have contributed to
Oh, wow.
the project. They've been here. But as I said about the Heritage Report, we read everything. We want to make sure that this stuff is all given consideration. And I think there is a really important and valuable addition to understanding the development of America that was presented by the 1619 Project. So that's part of our conversation.
Well, I think the 1619 Project has become a lightning rod. And I have criticisms of particular parts of what they've done. But the general proposition which they've made, which is that slavery and race have been fundamental to American history from the start, is, I think, something that's a very great positive in terms of if we're really going to understand our past. You cannot simply write about the great accomplishments of statesmen and pretend that this did not happen in a context in which the society is premised on property rights in human beings. Now, that's not to say that that denigrates the accomplishments of the statesmen. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is we need to think about these two things side by side as intertwined. And I think the 1619 Project has, in this broader sense, done some good for trying to think that way about our past.
Why don't we wrap up with, you have some exciting new stuff coming here at Monticello about the Declaration of Independence.
We do, yeah. So to your question about how often do we change exhibits, looming on the horizon, of course, is 2026, which is the sesquicentennial of the Declaration of Independence, or the 250th anniversary.
Don't ask me to spell that.
Semiquincentennial gets thrown around too. But 250th anniversary of the birthday of the United States, of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which is also the 200th anniversary of his death. And so we are going to be doing a lot of work here in our tours to find ways to talk about the lasting impact of the Declaration, global impact of the Declaration and what it means today, and to have more engaging conversations about Jefferson as an older man looking back on these early and tumultuous years of our founding. And we're also looking to expand our visitor center here to incorporate new exhibits that grapple with these subjects. So it's an exciting time to be here, and I'm grateful to work on it.
That's great. My favorite Jeffersonism is from the letter he wrote to a colleague telling that person he wasn't able to attend the 50th anniversary. And he says something about how the founding should be, it's like a clarion call to burst the chains of monkish ignorance. Human progress, right? It's a call for human progress. So that's terrific. Brandon Dillard of Monticello. Thank you. Alan Taylor, historian, University of Virginia. Thank you very much. This has been History as It Happens, on location at Monticello. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. My newsletter comes out every Friday morning. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com.